I want to make some things clear before getting into the video. While this video will criticise Death Battle, this is in no way a personal attack on the creators or the fans of the series. There's a lot to love about Death Battle, and I would still consider myself a fan of the series. The fight animations are, for the most part, amazing. The music tracks are always amazing, and there's clearly a lot of love and effort that's put into this web series. However, I want this show to be better in other aspects, so just as I would criticise any show for having inconsistencies and problems, I will critique Death Battle as such. While my critiques will mostly be focused on scaling and the winner of an episode, I will not bring outside sources into this video, at least for the most part. This isn't a video where you're going to see a salty Dragon Ball fan whining about how Death Battle didn't bring up a statement that makes Bardock solo fiction or something. This is going to be purely an internal critique and looking at the feats that Death Battle themselves bring up and the logic that they use. If you're a fan of Death Battle and you have no problems with the critiques I'm about to bring up, that's completely okay. This isn't some large-scale moral issue where people's lives are on the line or something. In the end, does it matter if Death Battle is inconsistent in the grand scheme of things? No. But again, just as I would critique any other show that I am a fan of, I'm applying the same standards as I would to Death Battle, because I like the show, and I want it to be better. Today I'm going to look at 4 specific episodes: Bardock vs Omni-Man, Spawn vs Ghost Rider, Kyle Rayner vs Simone the Digger, and Miles vs Deku. There are other episodes in the past that I could bring up which also fall under the same problems I mentioned in this video, but criticising videos that were made a decade ago is a level of cringe that I'm not quite willing to stoop to. Anyways, let's start with... This episode is infamous for its controversy, with the majority of casual fans thinking that Bardock was going to win. And to be honest, with the feats that Death Battle brought up, I really don't see how Bardock lost. I will say this is the only time in the video where I'm going to bring in external information that's not in the Death Battle episode itself, but it's not a feat or anything, more just something to substantiate my point. Firstly, let's look at the King Vegeta feat that Death Battle brings up, where King Vegeta waves his hand and destroys 3 planets. Death Battle puts this feat at 774.8 ronatons of TNT. I think I'm pronouncing that right. This is a bit strange to me though, because if you assume that the planet is about the size of Earth, then this number would be way higher at 1.8 quitatons of TNT. While yes, this might sound strange to say that Death Battle, shouldn't assume the planets are smaller than Earth since we have no frame of reference and Earth isn't the smallest planet out there, it's also far from the largest in our solar system, much less the universe. King Cold himself also says that the Earth is a small planet, meaning I think it's perfectly reasonable to use that as a baseline for the calc. In order for Death Battle to get the number they did, they would have had to assume that these planets were smaller than planet Earth, which sounds a lot like lowballing to the point of unfairness. Death Battle even has a corner in the video where they scale King Vegeta's attack higher than where they had him at, but consider it a high ball. Needless to say, I don't think that's really accurate. However, even if we take Death Battle's calc at face value and look at where they place Bardock and Omni-Man's stats, there's another problem. Comparing where they put their stats, Omni-Man would be 22.3 times stronger than Super Saiyan Bardock. However, if you look at their speed, Super Saiyan Bardock would be 23,750 times faster than Omni-Man. Surely, looking at Death Battle's own logic, Bardock would speed blitz Omni-Man to heaven and back. Looking at this from a different point of view, considering the lowballing of the King Vegeta feat and the difference in speed, it comes across to me as if Death Battle is biased for Omni-Man. Now, me saying that Death Battle has a bias shouldn't be controversial. I'm not even saying that Death Battle shouldn't have one. Literally everyone has a bias. It came bundled with your life experiences and opinions. Maybe I'm just missing something, but I came away from that episode frankly confused as to how they came to the conclusion that Omni-Man won. Considering Death Battle's motto is literally to decide once and for all who would win a death battle, causing confusion like this in the episodes is, I think, a problem. I think this is the most egregious episode when it comes to scaling because of this, but now let's move on to... I know I'm going out of chronological order with this by talking about Miles vs Deku instead of Spawn Rider or Kyle Simone, but this episode is far and away the one I have the least issue with when it comes to internal consistency, so I'll get out of the way first before going on to those 2 episodes. Speed-wise, they both have Deku and Miles at light speed. However, with Deku, it only comes when he's using Gear Shift. As a result, without Gear Shift, according to Death Battle, he would be at max 6,700, which would make Miles over 130 times faster than Deku pre-Gear Shift. This isn't as big a criticism, as Miles is way weaker than Deku in this episode, to the point where it's a far greater difference by comparison to their speed. So I would say that with their own logic, Deku should win. But then again, I do think it should be better explained instead of just glossing over that fact, because Miles would be blitzing Deku before he uses Gear Shift. Adding on to the fact that Miles has Venom, which he could attack Deku with, I think it would have been important to go through and explain why Miles couldn't have won that way, instead of just leaving it as a black box in the top right corner for a few seconds. Again, in terms of internal consistency, out of the 4 videos here, this is the episode I have the least amount of issues with. But that said, let's move on to the final 2 videos. I'm grouping these 2 together because my criticisms are the same for both episodes. In Spawn vs Ghost Rider, Death Battle literally has Zerathos at infinitely times stronger than Spawn's entire cosmology. Similarly, in Kyle vs Simone, Kyle is over an infinite amount of times stronger than Simone, and yet Spawn and Simone won. Looking at Spawn vs Ghost Rider at first, the Death Battle team had Spawn winning because Ghost Rider couldn't overcome Spawn's ability to come back from death through his soul regeneration and being able to warp reality to undo his own death. However, I think simply bringing this up and hand-waving it away isn't enough to convince me that Spawn could survive fighting the Ghost Rider, because while Death Battle says Ghost Rider can't kill Spawn, I think they're drastically underestimating just how big Infinity is. Is Spawn's reality warping so powerful that he could reset his death against someone who is infinitely stronger than he is? Or could his soul regenerate from attacks which are infinitely beyond his entire cosmology? I think it's a pretty big thing for Death Battle to gloss over. And it's not as if Ghost Rider is just a little bit strong, or even largely stronger. He is literally infinitely more powerful according to their scaling. It's funny that early in Death Battle they used to overestimate how Infinity is and how powerful it is, and now it kind of feels like they're downplaying it more than it should, in my opinion. Moving on to Simone vs Kyle, it's the same story, but honestly even worse in my opinion, because not only do they have Kyle being infinitely stronger than Simone and his cosmology, but also beyond infinitely more powerful than said things. The reason that Death Battle had Simone winning, to my understanding, is that Kyle could not get past Simone's regenerative abilities, and Simone would eventually surpass Kyle due to his potential growth. This, like Ghost Rider vs Spawn, it feels like they're glossing over a literal infinite advantage that Kyle has according to their scaling. And I don't think saying that Simone can regenerate better than Kyle has dealt with is a good enough explanation when Kyle is beyond infinitely stronger than Simone's entire cosmology. On a further note, I'm still not really convinced you can categorically say that Simone would surpass Kyle simply because we've seen him transcend dimensions before, because it would require you to have Simone capable of transcending his entire cosmology of Gurren Lagann, which, sure, he might be able to do, but it feels just a bit of a no-limits fallacy to me. There are also other issues I have with the episode. Firstly, with how they say their imagination is a tie. I find this bizarre because when they're talking about them doing just about anything, they only ever bring up power absorption, travel through time, and drills for Simone. Meanwhile, for Kyle, they outright admit he's far more creative and could create more things with his ring. If Simone and Kyle's imagination really is equal, then I would ask Death Battle to show that, because Simone being able to counter Kyle's arsenal through power absorption doesn't have anything to do with imagination to me, and I think it's quite laughable. Another problem is comparing the episode to previous episodes, where Death Battle scales DC's cosmology to potentially infinite dimensions, which are far more complex and layered than other series out there. To add on top of this episode, there is another statement where Death Battle have DC's cosmology as infinitely transcendent. So as a fan looking into this from the outside, I'm seeing Death Battle 1 minute scale DC's cosmology to infinitely transcendent, but then when I watch Simone vs Kyle, where the episode where the DC character lost, he is instead scaled to 12.3 dimensions. Now, I assume that Death Battle simply just changed their mind on where they scale DC's cosmology. However, without that being shown to be the case, it just does come off like bias. And therein lies both the problem and the solution to the issues I bring up in this video. Death Battle could be completely consistent and I am just missing something in their research, but their research and calculations aren't public. I think if every Death Battle episode there was a link to a Google Doc in the description which went more in detail about the calculations and why they changed their mind on certain topics, and also just an explanation, I think that would be a net positive. I genuinely don't see how that could be a bad idea, as it would give people insight who are interested in that sort of thing as to why Death Battle scaled the characters the way they do, and it wouldn't ruin the flow of the episodes either, as it would only apply to those who want it. Maybe Death Battle does do something like this and I'm not aware of it, at which point there's another issue of not publicly saying where to find this in the episode itself or in the description of the episode. At the end of the day, I do not hate Death Battle, far from it, I want to make that absolutely clear, but it does have issues when it comes to consistency and transparency, which, in my opinion, is very easily fixed and should be pointed out.